Thank you very much. This is a great turnout. I'm really flattered. If there was something else important to Washington, D.C. going on tonight, I think you know what I'm talking about. Thank you for coming. I'm Mark Rozelle. I am Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and we sponsor the Michael Hayden Center for Intelligence Policy and International Security that has put on a number of these wonderful programs over the past few years, and we will continue to do so. I'm very flattered by this turnout. I look very much forward to this special event. For those of you who don't know, George Mason University has a Schar School of Policy and Government that provides academic programs both in Fairfax and in Arlington, Virginia. And we have a number of professional degree programs primarily taught in Arlington in public policy, public administration, international security studies, which has been ranked #2 by U.S. News and World Report nationally, that we're very proud of. And I think the Michael Hayden Center, our Center for Security Policy Studies, a number of other entities at this school are a very important component of the recognition we've received for being leaders in the field of security studies. So again, thank you for being here. I look forward to a great event. I want to acknowledge the presence of Provost of our university, David Wu, is here. David? Several members of our Board of Trustees also are here tonight. Thanks to them for attending this event as well. But most importantly, I want to acknowledge the presence of the founder of the Michael Hayden Center and his wife, Janine, General Michael Hayden and Janine Hayden. General Hayden, we're really proud of you, to have you in the Schar School. Michael has been teaching for us for the past 10 years, and we look forward to him coming back to the classroom. And I think he has a few words that he would like to say.
Thank you again for coming. I think this is going to be a really interesting debut, and so I'm looking forward to it. Thank you again. Thank you.
I'm not on. Hello? There we go. All right. So I just want to take just another brief moment and acknowledge that this gentleman has been through a lot in the last year, and this was one of his first times speaking publicly since he suffered a stroke. So one more round of encouraging applause. So I know we're running a little bit behind, so I will shorten my comments, much to the pleasure of my management at the Schar School. First, I want to welcome you all here. I also would like to welcome the audience that is watching right now on C-SPAN Channel 2. So we're speaking to quite a large audience, and I think that's testament to the value of the material that the Schar School and the Hayden Center is bringing forward. Secondly, for those of you who are social media savvy, I'd love you to tweet along the event, put some things out there that you reflect some of the comments from some of our speakers. If you look in your program, if you do hashtag Hayden 2020 Vision, and then say whatever the heck you want to say about the event, that would be great. Later on, we're going to have a section of audience Q&A. Encourage you guys to ask questions. You probably have noticed we've got some microphone stands in the aisleways on these two sides. So when it comes time, when Margaret Brennan indicates it's time to ask questions, line up at those microphones and be prepared to ask a question. We'd love you to identify yourself, and if you've got an affiliation you're proud of, go ahead and tell us what it is. We'd love you to keep your comments brief and ask a question. Don't make a speech. If you want to make a speech, talk to us later. Lastly, we're going to have a reception for all the audience members, give you a chance to maybe talk to some of the folks, those of you who aren't going to rush home to watch the World Series game. But please exit through the back doors for the reception and let our panel members and our guests on the front row exit through the side door here, and I think it'll make for a more pleasant experience for everybody. The Hayden Center, we've got a mission to educate and inform about intelligence. General Hayden, through his career, I think was a little worried as to how intelligence was being portrayed across the nation, often in a very negative light. The Hayden Center allows him and us to better inform the American people about the incredible value the intelligence community provides the nation, and I think to emphasize the men and women who work in the intelligence community are your neighbors, they're your friends, they're your family, they're out there to do good for the country, and so we hope if you walk away with anything tonight, you'll walk away with that impression. This year we're sponsoring a series we're calling 2020 Vision. It is General Hayden and I were a bit concerned with the lack of focus on national security issues in the campaign so far. If you're like me, and I'm guessing most of you are like me because you're here and not watching the baseball game, you've been watching these Democratic presidential debates, and much of the conversation is steered away from the national security issues. And in my view, a president can do most good and most harm in the national security arena. Domestic issues, it's a scrum. It's a battle in Congress. But the president has a lot of authorities in national security, and he can move very quickly in that arena. And so we thought that we needed to do something about that. And what did we decide to do? We decided to run a series of events that we're calling 2020 Vision. The first of those we're having tonight is looking at intelligence in the U.S. presidential election. The conversation tonight will be guided by Margaret Brennan. She's the moderator of CBS News' Face the Nation. She's been the moderator since 2018. It's one of the longest running television shows in America. It goes back to 1954. It's today still one of the most highly rated shows on Sunday morning. Before that, she was CBS News, White House, and State Department correspondent, and then before that covered global financial markets at both Bloomberg and CNBC. We've got a powerhouse panel of U.S. intel leaders. Their experience stretches from the Vietnam War to the current day. I'll let you read their bios in the program, but I frankly think most of them don't require a lot of introduction. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on their introductions right now. I'll just mention, again, we have John Brennan, former director of CIA, former assistant to the president for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, and a long-standing 25-year career at CIA. John McLaughlin, former Deputy Director of Central Intelligence with George Tenet, led the IC from 2000 to 2004 through some incredibly trying times in our nation, serving as the Acting Director of Central Intelligence in his final months of his career. And he's just a legend in the analytic tradecraft. Michael Morrell, Deputy Director of CIA from 2010 to 2013, serving twice as our Acting Director. Also led the CIA's analytic cadre earlier in his career and served as a briefer to President George W. Bush, the only person in America that was with George Bush, was with the President of the United States on 9/11, as well as with the President on the day that we brought Osama bin Laden to justice. Andrew McCabe, Deputy Director of the FBI from 2016 to 2018, serving as the Acting Director in 2017 after James Comey was fired. He's got a storied career in counterterrorism, led the FBI National Security Branch and the Washington Field Office, played a critical role in investigating the Boston Marathon bombing, the attack in Benghazi, and the Russian attack on our election in 2016. So please welcome our panel members and moderator to the stage, and thank you.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. And what an incredible lineup of panelists that we have here from the national security community. We will be taking questions, but I'm lucky that I get to lead them off tonight. And I want to dive right in because there is so much rich territory to mine here. When we look at the question of the intelligence community and how it impacts people in regard to election security, can you help us sort of set the table, John Brennan, with that day in August 2016, when you went to Susan Rice, then National Security Advisor, and said, we have evidence that Vladimir Putin himself is directing election interference in this country?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here with Mike Hayden, who is a legend and icon in the intelligence community. So it's great to see you, Mike. In 2016, when I went to the White House, it was went to see the president as well as Susan Rice and a few others to talk about what we had determined at that point in terms of the interference in the election. And it was an effort to try to make sure that the President of the United States was aware of what it is that we knew and what we assessed, and that the work that we needed to do in order to try to get a better sense of what was going on, and making sure that the chief policymaker of this country had the information that he needed in order to safeguard one of the principal foundations of our democracy, which is the right of all Americans to choose their elected representatives. And so it was a discussion that I had with that small group, and then made some decisions about who else we needed to brief. I needed to brief then the Gang of Eight to make sure that our congressional leadership was aware as well, and how we were going to ensure that we would work, we CIA were going to work with our partners within the intelligence community, the ones that had those, the expertise, the capabilities, as well as the authorities and responsibilities, such as FBI and NSA, and how we needed to work this effort collaboratively and do it in a manner that was going to be apolitical, and an effort to try to ensure that the November election would come off without that type of exploitation by the Russians.
And largely, it did.
Well, I think it's quite evident now, after the Mueller report and other types of things, that the Russians did engage in this sweeping and systemic effort to try to influence the outcome of the election and undermine the integrity of the election. And it was directed by Vladimir Putin. And I've learned a lot of things since I left government. And I think the impact of the Russian attempts, the impact on the vote is unknowable. Mm-hmm. It was something that we, CIA, and the rest of the intelligence community did not assess. That was not our responsibility, our mandate. I've learned a lot about what the Russians were doing in that digital environment as far as putting out these personas and trying to influence the electorate's perceptions of the candidates, the situation in the United States. I am sure, personally, that those Russian efforts changed the mind of at least one voter. Mm-hmm. Whether it changed the mind of one voter or a million voters or more, I don't know. But clearly, based on what it is that I have come to more fully appreciate, especially what they've done what they did as far as pushing out this content, I am, based on my intelligence background and instincts, I do think that votes were changed. How many in which states, I don't know. And whether it made a difference as far as the outcome, I don't know. I do know, though, that the Russians have engaged in this type of activity, not just here in the United States, but abroad. They would much prefer to shape the politics of other countries through this insidious manner, as opposed to trying to use military pressure. Sometimes they opt for that in places like Ukraine. But if they can shape the outcome of these elections, particularly in Western countries, they have a toolkit of capabilities that they have leveraged. And in the 2016 election, they didn't do some of the things that we have seen them do in other places. And that's, I don't know whether or not as a result of our confronting them. I confronted one of my Russian counterparts in early August about it. Jim Clapper and Jay Johnson came out with a statement in October. And President Obama braced Putin also at the sidelines of a meeting in September. And so I don't know whether or not that confrontation that we had with the Russians dissuaded them from doing more things. People say that we didn't try to stop the Russians. We did, and maybe in fact the things that we did have resonance from the standpoint of the Russians deciding not to go to greater extent than they did.
Mike Morrell, who I should also say we're lucky we work together at CBS as well. Facebook said today that it removed 3 Russian-backed influence networks on its site that were aimed at African countries. And the networks were linked to a name that you know well, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was the same Russian oligarch who was indicted by the United States and linked to some of what John Brennan was just recalling from 2016. So does the fact that they're continuing to use the same tools, the same individual, mean that Russia and its efforts are just completely undeterred?
So I think it's fair to say, first of all, it's great to be here. This is my fourth or fifth event with the Hayden Center, and everyone has been a pleasure, and it's great to be here, and it's great to see General Hayden. I think it's fair to say that the Russians, in general, have not been deterred. I mean, it's not only in Africa that they're continuing to use social media to try to influence populations to think a certain way, to react a certain way, to split them, to raise debates, to widen cleavages. They're still doing it here. They're still doing it here as we speak right now. They haven't stopped. And not only have they not stopped, but we know from public testimony by the Director of National Intelligence last January that others have seen the benefits of this and have joined them. Dan Coates mentioned the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, and he said, and others. And I know how carefully analysts write. And I know that and others actually means something, right? And there's other countries that he did not want to mention that are also doing this, and I'm, be interested to know who they are, and I think that they're probably some of our allies, actually. So this is, not only have the Russians not been deterred, but because the Russians haven't been deterred, this is now spreading and becoming a larger problem.
So John, I mean, this is a new tool, but it's a well-known rival enemy to the United States. Why hasn't there been more of an adaptation by the intelligence community to be able to figure out how to battle it?
Well, I think people are working on how to battle it. What we don't know and what the intelligence community won't talk about and can't talk about is what they may or may not be doing offensively. That's the one part of cyber operations that you just don't talk about publicly. But I'm quite sure that our intelligence community is not relaxed about this and is vigilant. The bigger problem is not what the intelligence community may or may not do. The bigger problem is whether the US government as a whole can coordinate, in the absence of a cybersecurity coordinator in the White House, whether the US government can coordinate all of the tools at its disposal to both detect and combat what the Russians will attempt to do. And while it's true, as John said, that we cannot determine at this point with confidence what effect they may have had, if you look at volume 1 of the Mueller report, which is very interesting, it's a gold mine, and you look at the 4 states that were pivotal in the outcome of the election, take Michigan. Mr. Trump won in Michigan by about 11,000 votes out of roughly 4 to 5 million that were cast. So you can't be certain of whether that margin came from Russian influence, but we know from the Mueller report that Manafort evidently briefed a former Russian intelligence officer on internal polling data on those 4 swing states. So it isn't much of a leap to say this could have had an impact. And there were similar margins in Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, on which Manafort also briefed a former Russian intelligence officer.
Andrew McCabe, when you are looking at someone who came from within the FBI and how to protect against the kind of influence that was just described here, the debate in this country often focuses on whether Congress should pass laws to try to crack down on this, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. There isn't a lot of support for that. What can be done short of that legislatively to give the FBI more tools? Because when we talk to a lot of people from the Obama administration days, you hear frustration that when it came to recognition of patterns and speaking to states in particular, there was a pushback against the federal government trying to advise against how to protect against interference.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that there's an easy answer to the question of what tools or capabilities should the FBI have to do that work more efficiently and more effectively. It is a bit beyond the scope of the Bureau's kind of information in that area. There is no question it needs to be done. There's no question it should involve a legislative approach. We did encounter that sort of kind of pushback and resistance that you've referred to. But those are very broad kind of states' rights issues that, as quite frankly, that's an argument that the Bureau is not going to be able to settle on a state-by-state approach. We need a more consistent and cohesive approach to election security writ large, and that involves not just cybersecurity, but in terms of all of the processes involved in signing up and registering voters, maintaining the kind of sanctity of that information, and then, of course, right through the electoral process. The FBI is well placed to respond to threats as they're perceived in cyberspace by our intel colleagues, or here on the ground as that information comes to us through informants and other means. But the kind of prophylactic measures of kind of getting the states all on an even footing in terms of their approach to election security and cybersecurity, that goes far beyond what the Bureau is capable of doing.
Okay. Did you want to bring in a microphone? Sorry, I see your microphone was just cutting in and out, so we'll just jump in, Mike.
Yeah, I just want to add one point to what John and John said about whether the Russian effort influenced the outcome of the election. And I agree with them 100%. We'll never know. But in early 2017, I did a number of briefings on the Hill about what Russia did, and I was often joined by somebody from the Clinton campaign who would talk about what they were seeing at the time. And they would offer very interesting anecdotes that suggested that this mattered. And I'll just give you one. They saw in the final 2 weeks of the campaign social media blasts questioning whether Secretary Clinton was healthy enough to be president in critical swing states. And they would see their daily tracking polls move in response to some of these social media blasts. So I sat there and listened to that, and I said to myself, wow. And we'll never know, but you can't prove it didn't happen either.
Well, I think the Senate Intelligence Committee report on social media use in particular emphasized the focus of a lot of these Russian bots on the African American community in particular. And then among other fellow Republican candidates running against the now president, I think it was Ted Cruz and Rubio, who were focused on quite a bit too. What do you make, John McLaughlin, as an analyst, of how these fissures or perceived fissures are being exploited?
Are being
exploited.
Well,
is the same toolbox and the same pattern going to be replicated? Because
yeah, pretty much, I would say. As I think back on what they did, and again reflect on the Mueller report, they came at us on 3 vectors, and I think they will come at us on those same 3 vectors. One was to manipulate people. In other words, they recruited a number of people or naively brought them into cooperation with them, perhaps unwittingly, as John Brennan has pointed out a number of times. And so going back to your first question about what does the intelligence community do, we need to heighten awareness among everyone involved in the campaign about approaches from anyone from a foreign country. You would think that people would know what to do, but in this last campaign, a lot of people didn't even report those approaches when they occurred. So that's the first thing. The second thing is counterintelligence is very important in this period of time. Again, Mueller tells us that in 2014, the Russians actually had a team of people here doing research on which states were important, where there were swing districts and so forth. And so our intelligence community needs to be very much focused on that aspect of Russian activity. Are they here? What are they doing? Are they undercover? Can we detect them? And so forth. And then, as you said, they also tried to drive wedges into they wanted us at each other's throats. And they pretty much achieved that in some areas by driving wedges between social groups here that typically oppose each other by creating false platforms that in some cases used legitimate American organizations as vehicles for their own propaganda. So everyone needs to be on heightened alert here, and they also tried to break into companies that make software for voting machines. That's another area where we have to put up roadblocks. And then there's the paper ballot issue. There are still some states that don't have a paper ballot backup, and that, in the end, is the only safeguard against tampering with votes.
John Brennan, and I should say, no relation that we know of.
If you want to say that, cousin, sure, go ahead.
A lot of Brennans. In terms of looking at what's happening now, Hillary Clinton got a lot of attention in the past week and a half or so for saying that she was, in her view, believed Tulsi Gabbard, who is one of the Democrats running for the nomination, was a Russian asset. And her staff doubled down on that. She didn't walk away from the comments. Do you see what she was talking about there?
Well, I'll leave to Secretary Clinton an explanation about what she meant there. You can say something's a Russian asset, even if it's not intentionally trying to advance Russian interests, but because of what it does or what it says or whatever, it is, in fact, something that is promoting the Russian agenda. Maybe that's what she meant in terms of some of the things that Tulsi Gabbard has said in terms of on the international stage, that the United States should not be involved in a lot of these foreign adventures or whatever.
And a third-party candidate was something specifically she brought up.
Yeah, and the Russians are very sophisticated observers. I think, as John said, they've done a lot of research about the U.S. political scene. And they've looked at, a lot of different countries in terms of how they can influence events there. And sometimes it may be a third-party candidate pushing money into the coffers of some of those politicians or parties that they favor. And we've seen that being done in European countries. They also push money into some campaigns that they oppose, and because they want to put tainted money in there and then expose it as a way to undercut and undermine the electoral prospects of individuals. So the Russians will opt for a lot of different things. We have to be worried on the technical front, absolutely, in terms of when they navigate into electoral systems to see what they could do and whether they could manipulate the tallies. They also look for opportunities to be able to promote a certain theme in media, in journals, and other types of things. They will be able to befriend individuals who unwittingly will go along with their encouragement. Again, feeding money into even some academic areas as far as again, promoting something that they think is going to be useful in terms of the impact on the electorate. And then also looking at politicians who are going to be amenable, if not malleable, in terms of the overtures that they make. So, and then that digital environment is one, and I think as Andy said, there's no easy solution to this issue. We are, I think as a society, even setting aside the Russian interference election, we're struggling with how we're going to ensure that digital environment does not become the playground for all those who are trying to undermine this country by exercising freedom of speech, but pushing out bogus information, and information that can really undermine this country's again democratic foundations. How do you balance security with the liberties and freedoms that we love as a country? So the Russians take advantage of the openness of Western society, the freedoms and liberties in this country to be able to operate on the ground in the digital environment and other places. And this is a challenge that I think we're going to be facing, again, not just for the Russians, but others who really want to shape the influence or shape attitudes here in the United States, both the politicians as well as the electorate. This is the challenge, I think, for the 21st century. And I've been a longtime advocate of having a bipartisan congressional commission, just like after 9/11, when we tried to address some of the issues that might have contributed to the devastating attacks of 9/11, and we had the WMD commission after the Iraq War. I think we need a commission to take a look at that environment and how we're going to grapple with those challenges and not diminish in any way those freedoms and liberties, again, that really define America. But at the same time, not allow a lot of countries, entities, to take advantage of that to our detriment.
So while you're talking about this need to protect, the intelligence community is essentially being investigated itself from within. We know Attorney General Barr, and Mike and I have talked about this on Face the Nation, has launched this investigation into the investigation about the origins of the 2016 Russian election meddling probe. U.S. Attorney in Connecticut is leading that by the name of John Durham. Have you, Andy, been approached by those investigators?
I have not.
Do you expect to?
Well, I was there. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard.
I mean, you must be preparing for it, given that you were there.
I've got a lot to prepare
There are a lot of
for
people
these
who've
days.
reported. There are a
So
lot
it's
of
on-
people
it's-
who have reported you're expecting to be there. We'll put it that way.
It's on my list. Of course, obviously, I played a role in the initiation of the investigation they're looking into. So I would expect I'll be contacted at some point, but I haven't yet. I haven't yet been. And I'll say there is nothing wrong with, especially a new attorney general, coming in at the conclusion of a tumultuous and high-profile, controversial case, and asking questions about how that all began and what was the factual predication that led to the initiation of that investigation and how is it conducted. And those sorts of reviews take place all the time. They're typically done by inspectors general, and of course, one has done that now on these facts. What started as they refer to as the, Michael Horowitz's FISA investigation, ended up, at least in my own experience, as being a somewhat broader set of questions and issues, which again is appropriate. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. It's when, and so if that's the spirit in which the investigation is conducted, then I think it's something that a lot of people, myself included, would cooperate with. And
It's now a criminal probe. Does that change your view?
doesn't actually. I don't believe that changes as much as people have indexed on in the last few weeks. I think it would be odd to expect Mr. Durham to conduct that sort of inquiry without having subpoena power and things like that. So that didn't
And so
surprise
that's
me
how
too
you
much.
understand it, just the elevation to be able to obtain subpoena power and convene a grand jury. It's not that something is about to happen in terms of an indictment.
Well, I don't know what's going to happen, obviously, but it is not uncommon for the Attorney General to give a special counsel that sort of authority, even on the basis of, being able to bring in folks to submit to questioning and to ensure that they're not, people aren't misleading them in that questioning. The problem with this, Margaret, is when you have a factual scenario, which I think we have now, that indicates that some folks, and possibly even the Attorney General, are bringing a set of preconceived notions and biases to that investigation. And if that's the case, I don't know that it is, but there's certainly some indicators that it might be. Or that the purpose of the investigation is not really to get to the bottom of what did we know and why did we make the decisions we did, but it's more to run out theories, political conspiracy theories and things of that nature, then that causes me great concern, not personally, but of course about the state of the department and the intelligence community that's currently under investigation.
John, you were also there. What's your view of this now criminal probe, and have you been asked to speak to investigators?
Well, it's my understanding that it was a New York Times report that said that the Barr review evolved at some point into a criminal inquiry investigation.
Yes.
I do not believe the Department of Justice has come out officially and saying it's a criminal investigation. I may be wrong, but I believe it was just that New York Times report. I have cooperated with any type of review that the Congress or the executive branch has decided to do on the 2016 election or any other issue. I will cooperate with any congressional or executive branch review or investigation that is coming from, whether the committees or Department of Justice or whatever else. I think, like Andy, I would like to believe that any such review or investigation will be conducted in a professional, fair, and apolitical manner. And John Durham has a very good reputation it was working with a number of professionals who I think are going to try to ensure that this is done appropriately. I hope that William Barr is going to live up to his responsibilities as Attorney General to oversee, whether it be a review or an inquiry, but doing it in a manner that does not have any politics associated with it. So I have not talked to them. There are indications that I will be talked to at some point, just like Andy. I happened to be there at the time. I was involved in some of these things. I am very confident that CIA conducted its responsibilities appropriately, consistent with our legal authorities, and in a manner that was apolitical. And we were trying to fulfill our responsibilities to understand the counterintelligence threat posed by the Russians and what they were trying to do. It was a very challenging issue on the eve of a hotly contested election. And we were part of an administration, a Democratic administration. And one of the things that President Obama said to us is that he wanted us, CIA, FBI, NSA, to carry out our responsibilities as rigorously as we can, but not to do anything at all that either in reality or perception will be the equivalent of putting the thumb on the scale in terms of the outcome. And so we had to navigate these waters as best we could. And again, I look back on it and I feel good about what it is that we did as an intelligence community. And I feel very confident and comfortable with what I did. So I have no qualms whatsoever about talking to investigators who are going to be looking at this, again, in a fair and appropriate manner. And so if I'm called, I will be happy to talk with them.
So you don't, the Times article that you referred to also made reference to the idea that this could be politically minded. You don't necessarily assume it to be that? You think there are valid reasons to have this probe?
Well, I think as Andy said, if the effort is to try to look back and to ensure that things were done appropriately, as opposed to questioning the analytic assessment that was done and the judgments that came out of it, I'm not going to ascribe motivations to this, but I must tell you that it certainly lends some, there's an appearance, at least in the minds of some, that this is politically motivated because of the continued insistence by Mr. Trump that this is all a grand hoax and the former leaders of the intelligence and law enforcement community were involved in this effort to try to subvert the candidacy and the electoral prospects of Mr. Trump, which is the furthest from the truth that could be. And as Andy mentioned, there are some things that Mr. Barr said in testimony that raised questions in my own mind about whether or not he was looking at this, again, through the prism of what an attorney general should be doing, as opposed to looking at it from the standpoint of
What do you mean?
Mr. Trump's lawyer.
You mean language he used in testimony
Yeah.
in particular? You want to be more specific?
Well,
What he means is that in testimony, Barr referred to this as spying, which is a very unusual word to use about something that was a legitimate U.S. government activity.
And for someone who once worked at the CIA himself.
Yeah, and essentially the CIA was carrying, I wasn't there, but I know what they were doing. They were carrying out a counterintelligence mission, which they are legally empowered and morally empowered to do. That's not spying as we typically talk about spying. And plus, when you look at how Mr. Barr handled the Mueller report, I mean, to simply declare in presenting it before we ever had a chance to see it that it showed no collusion and completely, exonerated the president, doesn't fill you with confidence about the objectivity of the Justice Department going forward. So
he questioned the predication of the counterintelligence investigation. All he had to do is to look in the files of FBI
exactly,
and to see what had transpired before the decision in late July of 2016 that that counterintelligence investigation was launched. it would have been derelict, absolutely derelict for the intelligence law enforcement community to not pursue this in a manner that, again, was consistent with their authorities and responsibilities and obligations. Yeah. So it's really quite interesting to see that we are hit from one side saying, my God, those people didn't do anything at all. They didn't do enough to stop the Russians. The other side is, my God, look what they were doing. Well, yeah, it's kind of tough. It really is. And given that you had U.S. persons and U.S. persons affiliated with the Trump campaign who were consorting with some Russian officials that raised questions about the objectives and agendas and motivations and collusion. Given that CIA does not collect any intelligence or pursue any intelligence on American persons, U.S. persons, which is why we had to work so closely with the FBI.
That's right.
And share the information that we had, and which is why we set up a fusion group.
Right. So, and let me just give John a break here, although
Thank
you're
you.
doing really well. I'm taking notes. Look, what we knew is really not, it's well known. What we knew at the time, the fact that we knew that the Russians had been attacking us through cyber means at institutions across the country, but specifically political, academic, government institutions. We knew this as early as the fall of 2014. And we saw that activity peaking as we rolled into the election. We knew, and this is all widely discussed in the Mueller report and other places, we knew about their targeting of the DNC. We knew about their efforts to extract information from the DNC. We then knew in July that the Russians had used that material, weaponized that material with the intended effect of negatively impacting Secretary Clinton's campaign. And then we found out from a trusted ally that a U.S. person who was a part of the campaign prior to any of that information becoming public, prior to the weaponization of the DNC emails, said to this ally that the Russians had offered to assist the campaign.
You're talking about Australia.
Of course.
And
Well, no, I'm
George-
talking about George Papadopoulos. I won't refer to I won't specify who the ally was.
I think
You
he's
can
now running for
draw the
Congress.
conclusion. That's remarkable. So with that knowledge, and the knowledge that a U.S. person may have had foreknowledge of that weaponization, of those emails, and may have in fact been in some sort of contact with not just any adversary, but Russia, who we have a long history of understanding their desire to impact our electoral process, their never-ending efforts to undermine our liberal democratic order, driving the sort of wedges between different parts of our society, as we know they've done. We had a job to do. We had a very tough decision to make. We did it in the most even-handed and fair and quiet way that we possibly could, but we stepped up to that responsibility that we knew we were oath-bound not to ignore, and we did our job. And anybody who wants to come in now and sit down and talk about that, I'm happy to walk through this thing again and explain to them exactly what we thought at the time. If it's a legitimate effort to understand that, then we have absolutely nothing to worry about.
I want to come to Mike here too, but just quickly, on the Mueller report language, it said no proven conspiracy, but it did say there were numerous links identified between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. When you read the report, what did you think that meant? You, and then we'll go to Mike.
Not talking to me.
Sorry.
I thought, wow. That is a remarkable conclusion for any report. Numerous links between the Russian government or individuals affiliated with Russian intelligence and the Trump campaign. I mean, that is still an open question that I think a lot of people would like to hear the answer to. Why?
And you're one of them.
I would love to know the answer to that.
Mike, just to button up on the Durham probe, I know you have some strong feelings about that in terms of the message sent to other analysts and the rest of the intelligence community.
So I have deep concerns about the Justice Department looking at analysis and making judgments about whether the analysts came out in the right place, whether they did their work properly, etc. There are other aspects of the probe that I agree with Andy on. Take a look at whether all of the legal decisions that needed to be made to open up the counterintelligence investigation and the decisions were made along the way. That's fine, if it's done with the right spirit. But to have the Justice Department look at CIA analysis and ask them to come to the conclusion, did the analysts do the right thing? Did the analysts come out in the right place? Is highly inappropriate. It's highly inappropriate because the Justice Department doesn't have a lot of experience understanding the analytic process. They're not expert. John Durham, as good as he is, as good a prosecutor as he is, doesn't understand how we do analysis. Doesn't understand how we evaluate information, doesn't understand how we evaluate sources, doesn't understand how we come to conclusions, doesn't understand how we put confidence levels on them. He doesn't understand that. He doesn't do that for a living. He looks at issues and decides whether a crime has been committed. And I'm concerned about this because analysts at CIA who are going to be talked to, or perhaps who already have been talked to by Durham's folks, have had to hire lawyers. And I'm concerned that this will have a chilling effect on analysts going forward who have to make a tough decision in what is perhaps a political issue. Right? They're looking at an issue overseas, but it's got political consequences here. They might think twice in the future about having to make such a decision if they have to fear hiring a lawyer down the road and to defend themselves against the Justice Department. Now, the other point I'd make here is that people have already looked at the question of this analysis. The Senate Intelligence Committee looked at this and in a bipartisan way unanimously came to the conclusion that the analysts were right. That what the Russians were trying to do was divide us, to damage Hillary Clinton, and to help President Trump. So the Republicans and the Democrats on the Senate Intelligence Committee said the analysts came out in the right place. That's a proper place to look at this. The House Intelligence Committee came out in a different place because it's broken. The House Intelligence Committee, the Democrats said the analysts came out in the right place. The Republicans said they came out in the right place on trying to create divisions and on hurting Hillary Clinton, but they got it wrong on helping President Trump. But they provided no compelling arguments for that. So people have already looked at this. The proper people have already looked at this. John Durham should not be looking at it.
You agree?
Yeah, I think here's my definition of an analyst. An analyst is someone who deals with a situation of ambiguity, with information arriving incrementally, but under constant pressure to come to a conclusion. That means that analysts take reputational risks every day. And I think Mike's most compelling point here is if you put analysts in a situation where they're defending their analysis with a lawyer sitting at their side and someone holding a criminal prosecution over their head for a judgment they've made in a situation that I can tell you never has complete information in the manner that you expect there to be complete information in a courtroom before you come to a conclusion. That's a terrible position to put an analyst in. And the most compelling point Mike makes is this discourages risk-taking in analysis. And without risk-taking, you get pablum.
I think the other point to make here, Margaret, is that the standard for coming to a judgment in a criminal case is much, much, much higher than the standard for coming to judgment on an analytic issue. And so I'm concerned that John Durham, when he looks at this, is going to say, the analysts didn't have enough information to make the judgment they made. And he's looking at it from the perspective of whether he would indict somebody,
Right.
not whether he would make a judgment as an analyst.
Andy?
Can I just say to all the future analysts in the room, don't let these guys discourage you. It's a great job, and we need you now more than ever.
Actually, I see some right out there. I know who they are. Yeah. Charge ahead.
Yeah, well, in terms of talking about something that's continuing to also overhang the country, and certainly I'm sure the intelligence community, is the middle of the political fight we are all now in here in Washington with impeachment. And the president has made clear he has a lot of differences and distrust of the intelligence community. He has said that since he was on the campaign trail, and you hear that come up frequently. Now, the whistleblower in this case, as it pertains to Ukraine, we know, as has been widely reported, came from the CIA and happened to be detailed to the White House. What does this confluence of factors add up to here ultimately for the intelligence community? If President Trump is reelected, and he very well may be, what is that relationship going to be like? What does that mean for national security if that distrust continues to be fed, rightly or wrongly, but it exists?
Well, if I could take a crack at that, the one thing I'd be confident about is that the intelligence community will just keep doing its job. One of the things that is remarkable about it is there's a very clear sense of mission there. The intelligence community has been through a lot. Controversy is not unknown in that business. And therefore you get up every morning, come in and do your job, and that's what I'm confident they're doing. General Hayden and I have talked about this a number of times, and I think the relationship with Trump has gone through stages, and I think we're in another stage now. The way I would define the stages is the first stage was ignorance. He didn't know anything about it as a candidate. The second stage was hostility, and John has described that once it appeared to him that the intelligence information was somehow jeopardizing the legitimacy of his election. The third stage came about when he first confronted a problem in Syria, and he realized, and in North Korea, and he realized he needed it. The third stage was sort of the necessity of intelligence. And the fourth stage is the one we're in, I think, now, which is kind of resenting the need. But there is the need. You cannot conduct foreign policy without good intelligence. No president can, even a re-elected President Trump. And so this will always be, as long as he's there, a tense and conflictful relationship, which in many ways is the nature of intelligence anyway.
But there is something unique, you'd have to agree, that now
totally.
The impeachment inquiry is underway, sparked by a complaint from someone within the intelligence community. It feeds the president's concern and often used term about a deep state being there to take him out.
Thank God for the deep state. I mean, I think, everyone here has seen this progression of diplomats and intelligence officers and White House people trooping up to Capitol Hill right now and saying, these are people who are doing their duty, who are responding to a higher call. It doesn't, I guess it doesn't, well, think about it for a minute. With all of the people who knew what was going on here, it took an intelligence officer to step forward and say something about it, which was the trigger that then unleashed everything else. Now, why does that happen? What I tell American people why that happens is this is the institution in the US government that, with all of its flaws, and it makes mistakes, is institutionally committed to objectivity and to telling the truth. It is one of the few institutions in Washington that is not in a chain of command that makes or implements policy. Its whole job is to speak the truth. It's engraved in marble in the lobby.
This dysfunctional relationship, I think, that you're alluding to, the issue, the problem, is right near here. It's at 1600 Pennsylvania. It's not at the Hoover Building. It's not at Langley. It's not at Fort Meade. And the professionals that carry out their daily responsibilities in those places are going to continue to do what it is that they are expected to do. The reason why Mr. Trump has this very contentious relationship with CIA and FBI and the deep state people.
And you.
And me, yeah.
Specifically you.
I've heard
He's
that,
targeted
yes.
you.
Is because they tell the truth. because they cannot be manipulated like clay in his hands, because they will stand up and speak out when things are wrong. And they'll tell him what the truth is. And the truth he fears, because he has lived on anything but the truth, not just during his presidency, but even before that. So thank goodness for the women and men who are at the intelligence community and law enforcement communities who are standing up and carrying out their responsibilities on behalf of their fellow citizens. So if he doesn't use their intelligence, if he doesn't use their contributions to this country's security, well, bad on him. But our people who continue to fight the fight in the trenches here as well as overseas will do their work irrespective of what he is going to do or say about them. When they raise their hand in an oath of allegiance to this country, as Andy said, they have that obligation. It's a duty of their oath. And that's what compelled this whistleblower, whether he's from CIA or wherever, to speak out. It's what's compelled Ambassadors Ivanovich and Taylor and Colonel Windman and others to be able to say, this is wrong. Mm-hmm. This is antithetical to the values that this country was founded upon. And unfortunately, there are too many people on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue in the Congress who hold their nose over what's being done. And until they realize that what Mr. Trump is doing is trampling, again, the foundations of this great country of ours, we're going to be in for a rocky road. So I just am pleased every day that my former colleagues in the intelligence community are continuing to fulfill their duties.
Do you think the whistleblower...
It's not that I feel strongly about the issue at all.
No. I want to button up with you, and I see Mike, I know you want to talk here. Do you think the whistleblower should be compelled or be asked to testify? Republicans are saying, in defense of the president, he has this right to know his accuser.
The Whistleblower Act and the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Act are designed to ensure that individuals can come forward and speak out when they see criminality or things that are inappropriate. And they do so at great risk to themselves and to their careers and their futures. There are ways that the whistleblower, and why is the whistleblower even needed anymore to provide that testimony? Because it seems like everything she or he said has been corroborated by others. And so it's no longer hearsay as what the whistleblower was being accused of before. It is now the people who are on the phone, people who heard things being said. So again, what is being done right now is trying to attack somebody who is seen as a partisan. It's not. I don't see a reason but certainly not to expose the whistleblower's identity. I mean, there are some nasty people out there. I've come to realize that myself. And so that individual's identity should be protected. But there are ways to ensure that if that person has additional information that is above and beyond what the other depositions have provided, they can get that testimony in a manner that is going to, again, protect that person's identity and be consistent with the purpose of the whistleblower statutes.
Mike, I want you to jump in here, but I do want to tell everyone to get ready with your questions. You see those microphones there and there if you want to get ready and line up.
I just wanted to say, Margaret, that in this political environment, I think there are two myths about the IC. One is from President Trump's opponents who want to be able to paint a picture that his rhetoric and his behavior, as inappropriate as it is toward the intelligence community, is damaging the community, is creating morale problems, is leading people to leave, is undermining what the intelligence community does every day. That's one myth. It's wrong. It's wrong, as both Johns have said. People are just buckle down and do their work. The other myth is that the intelligence community is the deep state, and it is actively trying to undermine the president and weaken him politically. That, too, is wrong. And I think what's interesting is that the al-Baghdadi operation, of which this was a huge intelligence success, based on what I read in the paper, undermines both of those myths, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Because the intelligence job was so beautiful, and how could a demoralized place, crippled by people leaving, have done this job? And then the other is is if this really was a deep state out to get the president, why would it give him the political gift of being able to go get al-Baghdadi? It kills both myths.
We'll start here. Ma'am, if you'd say your name and where you're from.
Hello, my name is Christine Vargas, and I'm a political partner at the Truman National Security Project. Gentlemen, this question is for all of you. Thank you for being here. Long story short, you have a platform here to help inform all political campaigns, both congressional and presidential at present, on what they can do. And I would love to hear one point from each of you on both how they should watch out for infiltration, both digitally and in person, and what are some steps they can take to protect against it, as well as report it to the appropriate parties. And thank you.
Thanks. Andy, do you want to take that first?
Sure. So I'll pass on the cyber piece to my colleagues here and focus on kind of more the human approach. It is absolutely imperative that people who are associated with political campaigns at every level, right? So we're not just talking about people running for president, but people in state offices, particularly states that are impactful on national politics in one way or another, have to understand the threats that are facing them from the kind of the human vector, those individuals who will attempt to ingratiate a position of trust to try to influence those campaigns. These things are real. It's not just stuff you see happening in movies and you know, outlandish plot lines and things like that. And I think far too frequently, folks who are just attempting to enter politics fail to understand the significance of the threat they face just from straight up human operations.
I'll give you an answer on cybersecurity. Former Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson, former Secretary of Homeland Security Mike Chertoff, myself, a number of other people are on the advisory board of a new not-for-profit company called Cyberdome. And what Cyberdome is doing is providing pro bono cybersecurity services to any campaign that wants it. Democrat, Republican, Independent. So my suggestion would be pick up the phone and call Cyberdome, and they can help your campaign with cybersecurity.
A couple of things, following on to Michael's comment. Simple cyber hygiene for everyone, because the theft of the DNC material in particular was not a very sophisticated operation. That was a phishing operation. I'll bet if all of you took out your phones right now, you'd find someone phishing on your phone, some phony message that you could open and at your peril. That's basically what happened. So simple hygiene at all levels of the electoral process. And then one could go on, but I'm going to just give you one other idea. I think it's really important that every state have a paper ballot or paper backup system in some way. That is, in the end, while we're in this emergency period, until we figure it out with something like a commission, as John Brennan has called for, which I endorse, paper ballot. It's the surest way.
I think a lot is dependent on the candidate's leadership and instilling in his or her campaign staff a real sense of doing what is right and not doing what is wrong. There are so many ways that somebody may pursue victory at all costs. And I think we see examples of that right now in the U.S. political system. Take whatever type of information or whatever that might benefit you. To me, I think that the integrity that a candidate shows really is important as far as trickling down to their people and demonstrating the leadership that is needed. And that winning at all costs is not winning. In fact, it is losing, something very special about this country. So in addition to all those things, I think there really needs to be a sense of the values that the candidate really prioritizes.
Can you say your name and what organization you're with?
Ken Meyercord, citizen of the United States. Quickie for Mr. McLaughlin, who stated that CIA officers are sworn to tell the truth. Perhaps you could explain the meaning of the word disinformation in the CIA context. And for Mr. Brennan, Mr. Clapper recently stated that in pursuing his role in the investigating the possible Trump-Russian connection, he was simply following the orders of his commander-in-chief, suggesting that if he is indicted by Mr. Durham, he will invoke the Nuremberg defense, that he was just following orders. Do you consider that a valid defense?
On the issue of speaking the truth, I'm referring here to an ethic among analysts. That is their job. Disinformation is a misunderstood concept, I think. To the extent that it exists in the operational realm of covert action. However, I would say that even there, you know, when the CIA uses a term like, let's just use a term like propaganda, it has learned that the best propaganda is the truth. CIA is the organization that created Radio Free Europe, for example. And it's the organization that managed to get a lot of literature behind the Western literature behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. So frankly, disinformation in the classic sense that we see the Soviets deploying it years ago and the Russians more recently is not something the CIA does as a matter of practice and routine.
What Jim Clapper was referring to was that it was the White House, it was President Obama, that asked the intelligence community in early December to put together an assessment about what the Russians were doing, so that the next administration would have the benefit of the insights, of the knowledge, and the expertise that was evident in the time of the election period. And so that resulted in the intelligence community assessment that was done in early January, that was given to President Obama and then to President-elect Trump at that time. That's what Jim Clapper was referring to. So that doesn't, you know, bring in the Nuremberg defense or whatever else. He wasn't telling us to, you know, spy on the Trump, you know, campaign or to prevent the Trump campaign from being victorious at all. He told us to do our jobs as FBI, NSA, and CIA officers, but he did request this assessment, and I'm so glad he did.
All right. Ma'am?
Oh, thank you. My name is Amanda Linton. I live in Woodbridge, Virginia. And first, I just want to start off by saying thank you all for your service to this country. I'm deeply grateful for all of you. Getting back to the unnecessary attacks with the deep state that this president likes to talk about every day, what would be your words of encouragement for morale for those of us like myself who are considering going into this field?
I mean, I'd say two things. One is, as John mentioned, you can't make national security policy. You simply can't without really good intelligence. And that's probably truer today than it ever has been. So the work of the intelligence community, whether you are a collector or whether you are an analyst, is incredibly important, and it will remain so for a very, very, very long time. And that transitions to the second point, is that this administration will come to an end.
I want to just say that the whole idea of a deep state is the most sophomoric idea I've ever heard.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And not from you, by the way, whether you're a sophomore or not. But the way it's deployed by some of our national leaders, in truth, what is deep state? We're talking about the civil service of the United States, which is a jewel in the crown of this country. It's what, I mean, you've got outside this building, and probably a lot of lights still on in federal buildings, of people who are dedicated to doing a good job to support the American people. Is it perfect? No. Are there people there who aren't great? Yes. But by any human standard, it is a jewel in the crown of this country. And what I would say, I teach graduate students now, as a number of these folks do. I encourage them to go into government now, because when this is all over, there's going to be a renaissance of dedication in this country, and you want to be part of it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And if I could just add on a personal level, you know, in some ways, I'm probably like the worst recruiter for government service ever. And I get that. But I have to tell you that I firmly believe there is no better life than one in the service to others. And if you are the type of person that's compelled to this unique and unbelievably profound service to your community, to your country, then you should do that, because you will find a community of people that is diverse, it's broad, they come from every conceivable background, but they all come for the same reason. They are there for the same reason that you are, and that is to do good. And there's no better place to do that than in the places that we have served. And despite everything that I have been through in the last few years and all the horrible things that my family has been through, I would do it all again tomorrow if given the chance. It is the most righteous way to serve and to live. And if you think that's interesting, do it.
It's absolutely I won't belabor the point. It's the best damn career you could ever have. I am so jealous when I look at you and so many other young people in this. You are starting off in your careers. Our careers are behind us mostly. A couple of you have still, I think, some gas in the tank. But you know, if you have the opportunity to get into public service, intelligence community, or law enforcement, seize it. You will never regret it.
Thank you.
Sir?
Hi, thanks for being here. Jerry Dunleavy with the Washington Examiner. So we've been talking about Durham and we've been talking about Ukraine, but we actually have DOJ Inspector General Michael Horowitz's report coming out soon as well. So I had just a couple of questions about something that's at the center of it, which is Christopher Steele's dossier. So Mr. McCabe, if you would you be able to just say with specificity what the FBI verified in the Steele dossier before using it in FISA applications? I've heard generally, I've heard generalities, but specifically what was verified in the dossier before it was used? And also, if there's an explanation for why in the FISA applications, the FBI didn't just say, directly or indirectly, that Christopher Steele was being paid by the Clinton campaign. There are a lot of caveats and there's a lengthy footnote in there. But I was just wondering if you'd be able to answer those two questions.
Sure. So the answer to your first question is no. I will not go into specificity about what the FBI verified prior to the FISA or after. And the answer to your second question is I will wait, as I'm sure you will, eagerly to see what Mr. Horowitz's conclusions are in that report. That's a matter that he is I assume at the center of his investigation, and I am anxious to see what his thoughts on it are. As you've mentioned, there was an extensive and detailed explanation inserted by the Department of Justice into that FISA package that everyone involved believed accurately, or I shouldn't speak for everyone else, I'll speak for myself, I believed accurately reflected what we knew about Mr. Steele. So we're anxious to hear what the IG thinks about that, and we probably won't have to wait too much longer.
Thanks.
My name is Hunter Price. I'm a grad student at Georgetown. Thank you guys all for being here. It's pretty amazing to see everyone up on one stage. My question is that an issue in the 2020 Democratic primary has been breaking up some of the large companies, including some taken advantage of in the 2016 election, like Google or Facebook. The companies claim that this would harm their ability to stop inauthentic behavior from bad actors like Iran or Russia, similar to what we saw in 2016. Based on what you guys know about the threat and your knowledge of these companies' response to inauthentic behavior, do you think that this is the case, that breaking it up would hurt their ability to stop it, or no? Thank you.
Does anyone want to take that? We'll take one and then go over here because I want to make sure we get more questions in before we hit our time.
I'm not really qualified to answer that on a technical basis, but my instinct is it's a bad idea to break them up. These companies, I can be as critical of them as anyone, but they have also a tough job. And I haven't followed the whole Facebook controversy that carefully, except to notice that in the last couple of weeks, they have pointed out that they've removed quite a few false sites from Facebook that were both Russian and Iranian, not only here, but also in Africa, as Margaret mentioned earlier. So I think we keep the pressure on them to do that, but breaking them up, I suspect will end up having some secondary bad consequence we haven't thought of.
Thank you.
Sir?
Hello, I'm Marco Sorenstall. I'm permanent resident and university student at George Washington University. My question is to the whole panel on the question of impeachment. Recently, ads have come out into some key states where senators are going up for re-election soon, and the ads are whether for or against impeachment. Given that the U.S. 2016 election wasn't completely devoid of Russian influence, how can the U.S. make sure that its impeachment process is completely devoid of Russian influence? And does the panel see the Russians take an initiative to make sure to influence this impeachment process?
Is impeachment good for our adversaries? I guess you could put it that way. Anyone want to take that?
Well, I wouldn't say impeachment is good for our, let's not take a position on impeachment. All the turmoil we're in, that's good for our adversaries. I'd kind of leave it at that.
Okay. Do we have time for one more question, or are we getting wrapped? Okay, all right. We'll get you all to the game.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, nothing like, leave them wanting more is what I've always been told, and I think we definitely are leaving you wanting more. I apologize to those who are still in line. Perhaps you'll get a chance during the reception to ask a question. I would ask everybody in the audience to exit through the rear doors. Let our panelists exit through this side door. And it's 0-0, top of the second. Please thank our wonderful panel for this great presentation.